You know, when we picture the first English settlers in America, it's easy to think of that classic Thanksgiving image, right? But the real story, well, it's a lot more complicated and honestly, a lot more brutal. So today, let's pull back the curtain on what really went down between the English and the native peoples they met.
That's a pretty heavy statement, but it gets right to the point. This isn't a simple story about new friends sharing a feast. This is about a massive collision of two completely different worlds, a collision that would define the future of the continent, often through violence.
But here's the interesting thing. It didn't start with war. Not at all. In fact, in the very beginning, around 1607 in the Chesapeake region, the relationship was actually cooperative. It was this fragile, kind of tense alliance that was born purely out of necessity.
Okay, so this first deal was all about strategy. The great Chief Powhatan, he looked at these English settlers and saw pretty clearly that they had no idea how to survive here. But he also saw they had stuff he wanted, powerful technology. So a deal was struck. His people would provide the food and the know-how, and in return, they got guns and iron tools. For a little while, it was a classic win-win. But that piece just couldn't last. And the reason why is because these two groups had a completely different operating system for how the world worked. For the English, land was something you owned. You put a fence around it, it's yours. For Native Americans, land was a shared resource, like the air or water. You can see the problem, right? The English let their pigs and cattle just roam free, which to them is just what animals do. But those animals were trampling and destroying native crops. From the native perspective, this wasn't just annoying, it was an invasion. And this is where things really started to go south. As more and more English settlers arrived, their demand for land and for furs just exploded. This put a massive strain on native communities. Suddenly, men were spending way more time hunting for the fur trade, which threw their whole society out of balance. And with English guns now in the mix, tribes started fighting each other over the best hunting grounds. That initial fragile balance was tipping into total chaos. And that chaos, born from two clashing worldviews, wasn't going to stay as just tension for long. Inevitably, it boiled over into organized, brutal warfare. And this happened in both of the main English settlement areas, down in Virginia and up in New England. And when you look at this timeline, you can see just how fast it all fell apart. Over just 50 years, you see this pattern ignite. Bang, 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 all across the colonies. From the uprisings in Virginia, to the Pequot War, and finally to the massive, devastating conflict we know as King Philip's War. Let's take a closer look at a couple of these.
So, down in the Chesapeake, Powhatan's successor, a guy named Opechancanough, he could read the writing on the wall. He knew the English weren't just here to trade, they were here to take over. So he launched this huge uprising in 1622, but the English response was just overwhelming. After they tried again and failed in 1644, that was pretty much it. The surviving tribes were forced onto reservations, and their power in the region was broken.
Now, up in New England, the story is tragically similar. The whole thing kicked off in 1637, when a single English fur trader was killed. The response? English soldiers, along with some rival native allies, marched on a major Pequot village at Mystic. And what happened there? It wasn't a battle. It was a massacre.
I mean, just listen to that quote from William Bradford, the governor of the Plymouth colony. It is absolutely bone-chilling. The English set the entire village on fire and killed anyone who tried to escape. Over 500 people, mostly women and children. The brutality was so extreme, it shocked some of the colonists themselves. By the time the war was over, the Pequot tribe had been virtually wiped out. But the resistance was far from over. In 1675, the biggest, bloodiest war of the century erupted. The English called it King Philip's War. And this wasn't just a skirmish over territory. This was a fight for the very survival of everyone involved. The numbers here are just staggering. For the English colonists, the war was devastating, about 1,000 killed. But for the native population, it was an absolute catastrophe. At least 3,000 dead. For a much smaller population, those losses were unimaginable, and they would change New England forever. This was a war of total desperation, and the brutality on both sides was just off the charts. Native forces, led by the Wampanoag Chief Metacom, or King Philip as the English called him, attacked half of all English towns, and they specifically went after livestock because they saw them, correctly, as a symbol of the colonial world that was destroying theirs. The English, in turn, showed no mercy. They massacred villages, hunted down warriors. When they finally killed Metacom, they put his head on a spike in Plymouth and left it there for more than 20 years.
a gruesome warning. So you have to wonder, how did the English, especially the super religious Puritans in New England, make sense of all this horror? Well, this quote from an actual law passed in Massachusetts in 1675 gives us a huge clue. They didn't see this war as just a fight over land. They saw it as an act of God. And that brings up a really fascinating question, right? If you believe you are God's chosen people on a holy mission in a new world, why on earth would God allow, as they put it, barbarous heathens to burn down your towns and kill your families? What did they do to deserve this?
The answer gets to the very core of how they saw the universe. They concluded that the war wasn't a punishment from the natives, it was a punishment from God for their own sins. They felt that their society, this city upon a hill they were trying to build, had failed, that they were guilty of great backsliding. So, for the Puritans, this wasn't just a military crisis, it was a spiritual one.
Okay, so after all of that, why dig into this incredibly difficult and bloody history? What's the point of revisiting all this? Well, it's absolutely crucial because it forces us to challenge those simple, comfortable myths we tell ourselves about how America began.
And maybe the most important takeaway is this. Native Americans weren't just standing by while history happened to them. They were active players in their own story. They made strategic deals, they traded, they adapted to new technologies, and they fought with incredible ferocity to defend their families, their land, and their entire way of life.
So I'll leave you with this to think about. When we move beyond that simple story of a friendly Thanksgiving dinner, and we really grapple with this much more complicated, much more violent history of conflict, how does that change our whole understanding of where this country really comes from?